Welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast about ideas for curious minds with big appetites. I'm your host, Lee Delaney. On this episode, I'm talking to Marianne Cantwell, author of the best-selling career book, Be a Free-Range Human. Marianne is also an entrepreneur, coach, and a TEDx speaker. Her talk, The Hidden Power of Not Always Fitting In, has almost 500,000 views. Do subscribe, rate, and review the show on your podcast app. Reviews really help the show get seen by search algorithms. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork, and dig into a slice of curiosity cake. Curiosity Cake. Marianne, welcome to Curiosity Cake. Thanks very much for giving me your time.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Me too. This is really interesting. I think this is the first time I've read someone's book, like genuinely read it because I bought it and I wanted to read it and it was useful to me, and then actually talk to the author. So this is really cool. So the book, Free Range Humans, it's been out, I think the first edition was at 2013 or...
Yeah, it's Be a Free Range Human. I think it was 2013 when it came out, yes.
Yeah, and the second edition was 2019.
Yes.
And that's been like a best-selling book in career books. And you've got the TED Talk that I think's been watched by at least 250,000 people.
I think it's like 500,000 now. I'm not even watching. Something like that. A lot of humans who I don't know are watching it, which is nice.
And hopefully a lot of humans on the way to being free-range humans.
Yes.
So that idea, free-range humans, what exactly is it? What is a free-range human?
So a free-range human to me is someone who creates a career that allows them to essentially be who they are. So they're not leaving, a piece of themselves at the door. They're not trying to fit into someone else's box to get paid. And in general, that does involve, becoming your own boss on your own terms. But there are lots of ways to be, what I call free range.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff there, isn't there? The idea of going from the corporate world into doing something that's just for yourself that sounds great and exciting, but also sounds a bit scary.
Yeah.
But you've not just written the book. You don't just talk to people about how to go about doing this. You've actually done it yourself. Can you tell us about that journey that you went through?
Well, for me, I think it was over 10 years ago now. And I was that person when I was in school, university. I was always like the high achiever. And I really believed in the idea that if you did well at school, you got your grades, you got your degree, you focused, then somehow you're supposed to get this reward at the end. You've done all the right things, well done. Now life is going to hand you all these wondrous things. And so what I found was I graduated, I went into the job world, and suddenly I realized that this was not the picture that I had thought that I was going to be living the rest of my life. I ended up feeling in that really awkward place where you're lucky to have what you have, but you really don't want to have it. And that's really it's a hard place to be, right? Because you're like, I can't complain because other people have it worse, but this can't be my life. And I remember I was sitting in an office in London because I grew up in Australia and I'd moved to London for work. And I was sitting in an office in London, and it was like in a major corporate office in the middle of this sort of roundabout of cars around me. And I was just thinking, this doesn't seem to be the way that I can imagine spending the next decades of my life. And I tried everything. I tried changing careers, which kind of improved things a little bit in that I started to like the work I did. But again, I was working incredibly long hours and was spending all my time just looking out the window and feeling like I was living for, the next holiday, the next vacation. And quite a few things came to a head, and I thought, well, I've tried changing careers. I've done well in the careers that I've done, and I can see my future, and that is not the future I want. But no one at the time was really talking about this idea of creating your own business. Like working online wasn't a trendy thing. There were not like bunches of people doing it. But I remember one day, it was in the last financial crash, and I was taking my first holiday in quite a long time. And I'd gone offline for, I think, 5 days, and I turned the TV on, and on the screen, I saw these people in the building opposite me were on TV, and everyone was clearing out their offices. And I was like, what the hell am I watching? What has just happened to the world? And of course, it was the financial crash. It was like Lehman Brothers clearing out their offices. And I remember just looking at this going, hold on a sec. I was staying because I thought that was the only thing you could do to be secure. But when I'm working late at night, I'm looking at these people also working late at night. And then I get back to the office, and the offices there are empty. Their pot plants are dying. And suddenly I'm like, this isn't secure. Having a job isn't the secure thing that I thought it was. If this job goes and my industry goes down, I don't know how to make my own money. I don't know how to live life on my terms. And so I think it was a few months after that, or a month after that, I actually quit my job. I'd been building something on the side around career coaching. I had a few side projects, had a consultancy sort of side gig going, and I decided to make those into my full-time thing. And honestly, I haven't looked back since. Like, that was the start of a completely new era, and ended up traveling the world, growing a mostly online business. And yeah, that's the story. That's how I ended up free ranging before there was a name for it.
Yeah, so you were actually a bit of a trailblazer at that early time of people moving to what people would probably call now like the digital nomad sort of lifestyle, not necessarily having to be tied down to a particular place. And you were kind of out there kind of early on with like probably people like Tim Ferriss and people like that, I guess, maybe around the same sort of time that were doing the same kind of stuff.
I was after, actually, funny enough, I read Tim's book just before I quit my job. So I was just after him. But yes, it was very much at that early time when there weren't co-working spaces. I think there was one in London. And it definitely felt like a very different thing to be doing. And I think the good thing now is there's so many things set up for people who want to start their own thing. The tech is so much easier. You can get hold of things that will help you grow a business now that you used to have to pay a developer to make for you. And now you can get it for like $10 a month. Like, it's completely a different game right now.
What were those early businesses that you actually started working with? Because
I
think I think they didn't quite go according to plan in terms of the one that became the big one for you wasn't what you expected would be the one you stuck with.
Correctly. Exactly. I mean, I laugh now because when I left my job, I was very much like, I know what's going to happen. I've got this together. I know how to market myself because I'd been working in marketing strategy. So I was like, of course I know what I'm doing. And of course I had no clue what I was doing. So within like a few months, I started to realize that even if you know how to do strategy for a big company, you really don't know how to, growing your own thing from scratch is a whole other ball game. And so I had this beautiful business plan that did not map reality. And the business plan had this idea that I would take what I was doing in the consultancy I was working for. And I was like, well, I'm doing all the work for our consultancy clients, but I'm getting paid this terrible salary. So why I just get similar clients, charge less, and it will all be great. And of course, what I completely hadn't taken into account is that, when you're in a job, the work, even if you're involved in pitching and you're getting clients through pitching, the reputation of your company, all the mechanics that you don't see are actually what's bringing in the money. And so I really didn't have that. I didn't really know how to do that. So I had this grand idea of consulting in my existing field. And I had like maybe 3 clients that I worked with in the first year that paid a bunch of my bills on it, but it just wasn't going to be where I wanted it to be. I used to love baking cupcakes. So I was developing a vegan cupcake business before vegan was even a word people were using. And so I would, because I have a dairy allergy, so I would make these dairy-free and vegan cupcakes. And I was like I took them to events. I was selling them in different places. Turns out I have terrible attention to detail. And so what actually happened was that I was great at the branding of that, but I just couldn't handle the delivery of it. I had a business partner in the first year where we went into companies and did professional development. So we did everything from personality profiling to like team building days. And that was good, and I thought that was going to be the big thing in the first 6 months. So that first 6 months, I had all this stuff and I kept thinking something was going to be the big thing. But my side gig that I thought was always going to be the side gig was I had taken this very short sort of career coaching qualification while I was in a job. And I thought that would be interesting. I had this reputation. I'd always get the jobs I went for. So I was like, I'm good at getting jobs. I'll help other people get jobs. And so ironic. And so I help people write their CVs and position themselves for job interviews. And that sort of morphed into positioning yourself for a career change because so many people were having to change careers due to being in a recession, very familiar to what we're seeing now. What would actually happen, though, was when I was in sessions or I ran workshops in collaboration with another organization in London, when I was in sessions, people would come up to me and say, but how do you quit your job? And so I was like, hold on a second, I'm helping people get jobs. I really think that the job world is broken in so many ways. So it's not my biggest passion. And they seem to only care about how I quit my job. And so one day, this thing was growing. So this had actually become my main income by the end of the first year. But toward the end of that year, I ran a trial. I think it was a group program where I used to call it Figure Out Your Dream Career. And I twisted it to be about finding your dream career as your own boss. What if you wanted to make a living without having to go into an office again? That ended up being even more popular than my already full-time business with it. And that's what took off. Free Range Humans was actually a little blog project I had on the side that ended up being the more popular name. And that became the following came from there. And the whole business just came out of trying something out that I never in a million years did I think that this could ever be a full business.
And that's something that kind of makes it sound a bit lucky that particular element that you were working on it just sort of blew up. Some people might hear that and think, well, that's pretty lucky, isn't it? But actually you were out there doing it. And if you weren't out there doing it, it wouldn't have done itself.
Actually, I agree completely about the lucky thing because in a way, that's what I thought at first. I was like, oh, well, I guess I happened on that. But what I've learned over the years and when we run courses now, I have coaches who run courses for me in Free Range Humans. And when we run courses now, what we've noticed over the many years of working with people is that this story wasn't about just luck. In fact, it's a story you're going to hear again and again from different people in different ways. And the best ideas so often are not the one you think that's going to be the winner. Because when we're sitting with, the neat piece of paper or our laptop open, taking the notes and looking from the outside, we just don't have so many pieces of information, no matter how, I used to work in market research. So I thought I knew how to research, right? Even with a research brain, you still don't have enough information until you're on the ground, until you listen to that conversation, you hear what the customer's actually asking for. And I've seen this play out again and again. So it's why when we run, say, a course on finding your right business idea, instead of making it a mechanical process, one thing we get people to do is run live projects, not because they're going to find an idea, run a project and it will become their business, though that does happen, but in running that project by using the sort of tools that we help them find, or help them tap into, where you're staying very curious and you're asking certain questions of yourself. It's in the action that people find answers. So we're always staying here going, but I can't move until I know what I'm doing. We're like, well, you won't know what you're doing until you run a project. It's very rare that someone discovers what they want to do through filling in a few exercises.
And I think that's really applicable to how do you decide what career is right for you without actually trying all these different careers. So similar to you, I've hopped around different careers trying to find what I was happy with, what fit. And there was always something missing from each one. Yes.
And that's the beauty, I think, Lee, of having what I call a free range career, in that I found that as well. And, if I had just seen the descriptions of the things I'm doing now in the way that people at the time were doing a version of them, they wouldn't have fit. And I think when we come from the job world or even the traditional freelancing world, which is very similar, it's really common to look at potential careers as if they're pre-packaged things on a supermarket shelf. Like, that one has these ingredients, that one has these ingredients, this one fits in this way, this one doesn't fit in this way. And when you're a unique human being that has some complexity to you, which I'm sure your listeners are with the name of your podcast, then what happens is we look at these boxes and we don't fit into them. And so we think, I haven't found the right one. And so as you know from my book, one thing I talk about a lot is how one reason I'm so passionate about the free range approach is that when you're not going for a job, when you're becoming your own boss, you can rewrite that job description entirely. So how I run my business day to day isn't going to be the same as how someone else with a similar title for what they do does it. You know, the places I spend my time are different. The way I market is different. Where I put the emphasis in my work is different. And so I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've had, is that I really don't believe that there's a dream business out there to be found. I think you find one that's like really, really close, and then you customize it to fit you. I think that's the only way that I think people like us will ever find something that really fits us, is to make it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great idea. And I've really got the image in my head going around of, you know, the job world, trying to move from job to job, but each job is it's a set of tasks and an organization that you have to fit completely into. And you have some really great ways of talking about that in the book. Whereas the free range idea is not squashing yourself down to fit into those spaces, but looking at what fits to what you want and the lifestyle that you want to have.
Yeah. And getting really creative with finding solutions for it. You know, I think sometimes, I don't know if you describe yourself as a perfectionist, but I'm going to suspect you may. I definitely describe myself that way.
Maybe a lazy one.
A lazy, that's interesting. A lazy perfection. What's a lazy perfectionist?
Well, I think there's times, there are certain things when I'll really push the perfectionism, like stuff around the podcast. I'll put a lot of effort in, but then there's other things where I'm like, well, I don't care quite so much about that, so I'll cut myself some slack. And usually that's kind of day job things.
Oh my gosh. I think I'm exactly the same. I just think I'm an obsessive perfectionist. Anyone who partners with me on any colleagues of mine, they laugh. Like, if I'm sending out an email to clients, like to a group of clients, I'll probably have 10 to 12 versions of that email written. Like, I'm completely a perfectionist. So I think that people like with these obsessive tendencies like us, it's very easy to kind of think that there is one way that we have to show up, you know, that there's this certain box we have to fit, this mold we have to fit ourselves into in order to be enough, in order to fit in with an industry, in order to be able to make it work. And so much of, I mean, my personal journey and also my professional journey has been really realizing that those who rise to the absolute top of their field, and I'm really obsessed with top performers right now. So those who rise to the top of their game usually had something that was a bit different about them compared to other people who dominated their space at the time. So I've got so many examples of this, but you think of someone who is maybe I think of someone immediately who is a specialist, a doctor, a specialist in his field, who was a lot more extrovert and outspoken and, you know, people personally than other people around him. And he ended up rising up because of that personability and that difference was exactly what led him to be able to rise up and lead teams more effectively. I can think of people who were a lot more methodical in how they approach things in a field that could be very, you know, fluffy, and they end up rising because they own their difference. And I think the danger of fitting ourselves into a box is that we actually squish down our greatest superpower. And when you're in a job, that might be the sensible answer to get through the day, you know, and not get fired, as I've definitely experienced. But when you're free range, then you literally can't afford to hide your biggest superpower, because that's the biggest asset you bring to the table. And I think that's why when you're on this journey, it's very much a personal development as well as a professional development journey.
Yeah, that really comes across really well in the book, I think. And there's really something there about you're really selling what's different about you.
You have to. I just don't think there's another way around it. And I think that's, again, Sometimes I get the people who haven't read the book who just hear it and they'll go, well, that's not realistic. And I'm like, well, what exactly is realistic? How on earth are you supposed to stand out? How on earth are you supposed to really rise to the top of what you're doing when you're using your third best gear all the time? It just doesn't, it's not even a logical thought, but we think that because we had to act like that in a job in many cases.
We're a bit abstract at the minute, so maybe let's get into some of the practicalities around how can people go about becoming a free-range human?
Well, I think it depends what stage you're at in your process. So I think the first thing would be, do you have an idea yet? Do you know what you want to do? If not, then that really is the place to start. So in my book, as you know, Lee, it's purposely separated into different sections, not just because it looks tidy, but because we use different parts of our brains at different stages in what we're doing. So one of the stages is if you have no idea what you even want to do, or you keep sort of having half ideas, but they're never quite right. The first stage is actually the dreaming stage. And that is kind of, it sounds easy, especially, people who love to daydream, but actually allowing ourselves to dream about what we actually want and our life when it's linked to our income brings up a lot of stuff. As I always say, there's years of therapy in that, but you can get through it without that. But it really does, right? Because, even when I say it, I catch myself and I catch myself thinking, dreaming, that's for people who are privileged, who don't have to work, who don't have to earn their own income. They must have a trust fund. That's the first response that I know I have, though I probably have a lot of issues, but that's also the first response a lot of readers have. And so
I think a lot of other books that we'd be talking about, set up your own business, go it alone, things like that, would, I think, not have that realistic kind of tone.
Yeah, I know. I think it's because I have a very active inner critic. And so I feel like I have everyone's inner critic in my head. So I'm just going to say what we're all thinking. But, that's the truth. I used to read these books. And when I was having a good day, I'd be like, that's amazing. And when I was having a less good day, I'd be like, who is this person? And so I was very careful when I wrote my book just to really acknowledge that. And the reason we talk about dreaming is it's necessary. Because I think there's a line I write in there that if you're trying to, imagine your dream vacation, but you don't allow yourself to think of any destination further away than the end of your street, then you're not going to get very far. And I think that's exactly what we do when we start to think about what we want to do. We either think of something that feels so out there and impossible that it's like a one-day thing. And so we're like, oh yeah, but that's not for me, not in this lifetime. Or we think of things that are so 10% better and our heart kind of drops. But there's a whole space in between the two. So the first thing I do is to get people to put their rational, critical mind at the door just for this part of the process and know that it will still be there when you walk out. So the first part is to create the space to actually dream, actually tap into what you want. We have a whole thing about knowing your yes and your no, which is such a big thing, knowing what a yes and a no really feels like and knowing how to adjust what you're thinking of based on that. So the first thing I'd say is allow yourself to dream, allow yourself to know what it is that you want, what don't you want, getting really, really clear on that. The next stage is to start to put in a little more information. So I work a lot with personality profiles. Not because you're going to do a profile and it will tell you what your future is. We're all more unique than that, but because it allows us to see patterns about ourselves that sometimes we put a lot of judgment around, or sometimes we just think everyone is like that. And so one thing I'm really keen on people doing is getting to know who you are based on both your own information, your own process, but actually also on some external input. So we get people to do a couple of profiles that really show you with such clarity, this is the thing that keeps coming up about you. That's not going to go away. And if you try to put yourself in a position where that's not able to shine, it's not going to work. I have examples about that I'm happy to share from my own life. But from there, when you start to hone that, the next thing is to shortlist your ideas and to run some projects, which is just what I talked about here. This is where you actually hone down your ideas and run the projects to see what happens. And so you distill an idea down to something you can try out in a couple of weeks, which I talk about in the book. And that, again, is really key because we're getting out of our heads, we're getting out of the theory, and we're actually taking action. And only after that do we come back and start to process what's working for me. What of the things I have now seen is my best next step based on my needs? And you can formulate a plan from that point so much more clearly. But if you have an idea already and you know what you want to be doing, the very biggest thing I tell people to do is to make sure it doesn't stay an idea. Because when it's an idea, even if it's the best business idea in the world, if you leave it by itself, that thing is either going to sort of shrivel up and you're going to question it and it will die off, just like a plant that doesn't get any water. It's going to die if you don't pay attention to it. Or it's going to morph into the biggest idea in the world that you can't take action on. So it's going to go from, I want to run these sessions with people, to I need to create an app and a global community before I can take my first step. And so the quicker we move into momentum, the faster things will go. And the good thing is that you can do this stuff on the side of your business or your current job. But those are just a couple of the things that I tell people to get started with.
Yeah, I think combating that, the inner critic and also the overthinking, I think are really essential. And probably kind of listeners maybe around the academic realm who are kind of thinkers as well and might want to make the switch away from academia, or trying to get into particular roles, or trying to imagine how can I move into industry, things like that. Those kind of negative self ideas are kind of going to come in there.
Yeah, I find it, I've definitely worked with people in academia a lot. I find academics, lawyers, and I feel it's one other group that I have this a lot with, but no, academics and lawyers in particular, there's something about, I think it's the very hierarchical structures in both of those professions and the very not by the book for academia, but there's something about those that leads to, I think you need to actually spend a little more time in the early stages because, you're smart, you know how to think your way to a solution. But, I've worked with incredibly intelligent people over the years. And if you haven't thought your way to a solution yet, it's not because you weren't thinking hard enough. It's because you were looking in the wrong places. And we need to open up new parts of your mind and have a very action-based approach to getting information, because the world that you're trying to move into has so many facets to it. It can't be seen from the outside. You don't know the reality of someone's success in their business by looking at their website. You could stay up till midnight Googling what people are doing in the field you're considering. You wouldn't know what they're spending their time on day to day. You wouldn't know how they actually get their clients because you don't know if the website you're looking at is their main way of making money. So you don't have any of that information. But when you actually start taking that action, that's when you learn things. You learn which conversations you're having hit home, which are the parts where you're having a moment of success that you can build on. What are the real things going on in these communities? And that's where real data comes from. So I always say, for some reason I always pick lawyers and academics, but I know it's a lot of us. I always say, you love information, and there is no way you can get perfect information by sitting alone looking at a computer screen and wondering what's going on. Like, you have to get moving, get into the right spaces, surround yourself by the right influences, because this is where things start to shift.
And I think in there is a really good idea where I think you put it really well in the book, is to stop comparing your inside to other people's outside.
Yes.
I love that idea.
Exactly.
And there's so much of that with like Facebook, Twitter, and social media stuff that we're always seeing what people are presenting as the best of themselves and comparing that to the days when maybe we feel a bit rubbish, feel a bit groggy, and we're not doing our best work or we're not as productive.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I see a lot of people around academic Twitter with imposter syndrome as well. And they talk a lot about imposter syndrome, we're not feeling quite good enough. So I wonder how much of this mental side of things comes into the work you do with people where, like you're saying, maybe people talk themselves out of this idea, or the idea of just being free, not relying on someone else to create ways for you to have money, to do that yourself. What
It's
do you do when
huge.
that's too scary for people?
I think there's two different ways it shows up as scary. And I think one of them is the sort of person who says, yes, that's really scary, and is very open about it to themselves. And then there are the others who, instead of words scary, we co-opt language like realistic, possible, reasonable. And so some of us, and I am one of these people, is how I know my kind, we, instead of our first instinct, instead of admitting to a fear, is we start to label that fear as something that allows us to get out of dealing with it. Like, that's not realistic. That's for someone else. That's for someone privileged. That's for this sort of person. And so both of those are really, really important to be aware of, because when we know that that's how we show up. So, either we run away from it, or we step back, or we start to compare ourselves, or we start to get a little bit annoyed around it, then we know that's a clue. When that sort of comes up in us, we can get curious around that. And I love the name of your podcast, because I think curiosity is one of the biggest tools that we can have in a transition and in stepping up to a new stage, even in a business. Because, we don't just learn something and do it. Sometimes it takes a bit of curiosity. Is that reaction that I'm having to this? Or is that thing I know I should do, but I'm not doing? I'm curious what's going on there. What's the story I'm actually telling myself? And when you apply this very gentle curiosity to it, it doesn't seem as black and white anymore, right? Like, there's something you can do with that. It's something to explore. It's something to create a game around. Okay, so I'm telling myself that if I try this out and it fails, then it's going to be like too embarrassing, or I'm going to it's not something I'll be able to get over, whatever the story is that we have. And so we say, okay, well, let me create a game around that. What would it be if the terms of this game were to try it out for 30 days and end up with this outcome? And that was the whole game. How would that feel? And so you change the terms of the game and you get playful, and things can change really quickly at that point. Because when instead of going from this has to work and everything has to be perfect and I have to know the answer immediately, or it's not worth my time, to, okay, there's actually a staged process here. And I can set the terms of the game at every point. Now we allow ourselves to get into momentum, and now we end up moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that's a really nice, gentle way of confronting people with the fact that quite often we're holding ourselves back. It's not society, it's not other people, it's not our families. Like, we're actually doing that to ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it also is society and our families. And other people, let's just be honest. But, once we have that, once that's a baseline, probably it's there. There are one of my favorite books in the world is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And it's based on Stoic philosophy. And if you haven't read it, you would absolutely love it.
It's going on my list.
Oh, I love his work. He's fantastic. But
I love a bit of Stoic philosophy as well.
He distills it down so well. But one thing that really comes up a lot in that book is that there's this magic into turning our adversity into the fuel for what we do. So I call this, in my book, I call it the reasons why not. We all have our reasons why not. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are personal, some of them are social. They're there. Those things are just there. But there is always one more thing that we can do, more than what we've done, despite that reason why not. So that doesn't mean that, no one has adversity. That doesn't mean that privilege and lack of privilege isn't real. But it does mean that, that doesn't change it for you personally. And I think sometimes we can turn these things into academic exercises. Like, here are all the barriers. Here's why they're real. And I'm like, yeah. And that's where we're starting from. Like, it isn't about where that person started from. You're not in a race with them. You're looking at your today version of yourself and saying, where would I like to be next year? Where would I like to be tomorrow? And your reason why not is just like this thing to be creative about, which is why I dedicate an entire chapter in my book to it. Because once we just see it as, okay, that's just the lay of the land. I'm going on this hike and there are some boulders in the way. It doesn't mean you don't go on the hike. It means you get really creative and curious to see, how has someone like me gone around this boulder? How could I go around it? And I know it sounds very self-helpy, but I am very self-helpy. But I mean, the reality is, it's not an academic exercise, and it's also not just about learning business tools, because as I say a lot, you are the biggest asset in your career when you're free range. And so if you aren't looking at how your biggest asset is functioning, then it will never be at its optimum. And so that's why, I think this discussion is so much more real than just a step-by-step process.
What would you say to someone who really wants to go about this, but they want to really shift into something very different, and they've got maybe a great CV that's in a particular area, they've got lots of experience, lots of skills, but it's not in the place they want to get to?
Interesting. Well, I think I actually would, the first thing I'd actually ask them is, have they actually done anything in this new area before? So that would be my first question. So is it that you've never done anything as a full-time paid job? Have you really done nothing in this new area? And the answer is, I've really done nothing in this new area. My answer is predictable, which is do something, like create a project. Like, it's very predictable. That's what I'm going to say. And it's true, because you can create your own, I guess, your own status. And again, I talk about this in my book. Sorry to keep dropping it, but I talk about everything there. But I talk about this, how you can create your own status in a new field with, there is work, but it's not like a crazy amount of work. You can get something started, to be the founder of, to have spoken at, or if you're not a speaker type, to have helped people with, to have made the thing. Like, once you've done the thing, it's a very different game. And so if you've done something like, but what do I do with it now? Then, the first thing is to troubleshoot the problems you're really trying to solve. So is it that you want to be growing this as a side gig? Is it that you really want to be quitting your job? Now, if you really want to be quitting your job, is this thing the fastest way you're going to quit your job? Or would it actually make sense to grow this while, say, freelancing in something that you did? So all of these questions, the reason I say it is that there isn't just a step-by-step process that fits everyone. It really comes down to, number one, if this is a dream, make it into a reality. Like, actually do the thing. You don't need to leave your job to do that. Two, it's what do you do from there to grow it? Well, that's going to depend on a bunch of factors, like your personality. I have, in my book, I talk about there's 3 different styles of attracting clients and opportunities. And there are 3 different free range styles that I've identified over the years. And only one of those styles is to be the upfront brand owner who is very visible, which is my style. The other 2 styles are very different. There's one that's a trusted person that actually grows a little bit under the radar, but very successfully through growing trust with a group of people, as I talk about. Another one's a connector, who is this networker. And once you understand your style, then the next steps come out of that. So if you're like me, if you're that upfront attractor style, then it's going to be about both getting your first clients and customers, but also growing your visibility, being as visible as possible, allowing yourself to be that magnet. If you're the connector type, it's going to be about growing your connections. If you're the trusted person type, that's a completely different approach again. And that's more about proving your expertise and your worth and showcasing that to the right people. But there is going to be a way forward. And yeah, I think, does that answer your question?
Yes. And it's also, going back to your self-help, kind of jibe against yourself there. I think, you're always talking about action, and you're encouraging people to take action quickly, which I think is quite different to, a lot of the self-help stuff. You're not talking about manifesting this great new life through imagining it. You're saying, you've got to actually do concrete things and get out there and do it.
Yeah.
And as well as with the privilege kind of stuff, because you're very much encouraging people to don't do this by putting yourself in debt. This is a third way between having a job and being a high risk entrepreneur.
Yes, 100%.
And you actually specifically talk about how can you start something for less than $100.
Yeah, whatever you have available, right? Like, if you have more, then maybe you can get better systems. But the reality is, the systems you invest in are not going to be the reason that you make your first chunk of cash. Like, that's the reality. Like, as you grow, you can upgrade what you do. But, there's so much right now online, because the online business industry has grown so much, the great side of that is it's easier than ever. And I mean that. Like, if you look at how hard it was when I started out, I don't mean this as one of those, like, I walked to school like 20 miles in the snow kind of stories, but it kind of feels like that. When I started out, you couldn't do the stuff you can do now without a lot of time and money. Now you can just get free trials of things, try things, start things. But I always say, keep it down to what you actually need. Is it that you need to attract in a couple of first clients? Well, you probably don't need some super fancy customer management system, right? Like, I always tell the story of how, I was so clueless when I started out. And so whether it was business clients or personal clients, I literally took payments by bank transfer. Like, I can't remember what you guys call it in the UK now. Now I live in the States.
Bank transfer? I would say bank transfer, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I took it by bank transfer because I was like, I don't know you can take payments online. And then I discovered PayPal and my life massively changed. But, I didn't go out there and say, I need to have a complex checkout system and a perfect website, because if you do that, you put all your resources into what I call the business shell. And that's where people put money and time, like a lot of money, into building something that looks like a business. But the reality is, if you don't have 500 clients, you can welcome them in one by one, right? You don't need a process for that in particular. You can welcome them in. Probably use something like PayPal or a PayPal alternative to take payment, because you don't need to do bank transfers. But, it doesn't have to be really that much more complicated to start with. I see a lot of people saying, oh, you need to like spend loads of time on all the social media platforms. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because that's not how anyone I know got their first clients or customers. People get them through actual connection. So if you're going to do something, do it well. Like, go on one platform or two platforms, or don't use social media and do stuff, in person through groups. So I always think, go back to first principles, like, not what should I do because that's what all the gurus are saying, but saying, what do I need and what's the minimum viable step to get that? And it actually makes you more effective, because you're not throwing money or throwing time at a problem. You're being really intentional about your next steps. And that's why the whole start for under $100, £100 thing is actually, to me, a really interesting exercise in getting back to basics. And actually, you can spend what you want in the end, but if you start to think like that from the start, you end up becoming a lot more creative in your solutions.
Well, it makes you really hone in on what's your idea and what are you actually offering to people. And as well, making that quicker start means you're interacting with your customers, who can then tell you what they need. And that's, one of the most important things you need to hear.
100% agree. That's it. No system and no whatever you can buy is going to do anything if you don't know how to communicate with your clients and customers, if you don't know how to reach them, and if you don't know how to go from interest to purchase. That's the basics. I'm currently redesigning our sort of more advanced course for people who are already out there but want to really rise to the top of their field. And even those people I'm taking back through these basics right now. I'm like, I know we're about to do some advanced stuff, but none of it matters. If you can't say what you do in a way that gets people going, I need that. How do I sign up with you? And that doesn't matter if you don't know how to go from there to now they've bought. So that's the thing that matters the most, because everything else about where do I get thousands of people knowing about me, that's all amplification. If you can't get 1, 2, or 3 people to do that, to have that response and go to a yes, whether it's a product or a service or whatever, then all the ideas don't matter. And that's why, one big tip I have for people I often have people say, how do I create my first online course, for example? And my first question to them is, have you ever taught this to anyone in person? Have you ever taught this to a group and got paid for it? And their answer is no. I'm like, don't create the online course then. Go off and get 5 people and run this with them live over a 4 or 6 week period, and actually have to teach it and actually hear the parts where they're stuck, hear the part where it isn't working. Because firstly, you'll make a better product. But secondly, you'll actually have had to, instead of getting lost in all the creation of something that no one's bought, you'll actually have had to sell it first and had the conversations. And everything you see online that's automated, very rarely did it come from someone who hid behind a computer and never interacted with a human being. So I'm always like, even if you're the most introverted person in the world, you can do this because your superpower is listening. So you can have questions and listen and reflect it back to people. And that's how you can just get started and grow much more realistically.
Superpowers, it's reminded me, another question I want to talk about is how do we recognize those? How do we recognize our talents? Because I know I do this in my day job where I manage people and we talk about their objectives and their development and their growth. Quite often people find it really difficult to say what they think they're strong at, which is probably partly a bit of a British thing of not wanting to seem like you're banging your own drum.
Yep.
And maybe that's a wider thing as well. So how can we go about doing that?
Oh, I love that. Strengths are my big area. I'll give you a few tips on it. There's so many ways to answer that question. I'd say there's two different approaches you can use. One of them is the way where you're looking back at patterns and evidence. So that's where you can do something like list the highlight moments or the things that you've had most success with professionally and personally, and then look for what was the thing that led to that. Was it around how you showed up with people? Was it around your accuracy? Was it just start to list out all the features? And when you start to look at the list, go and see which ones are coming up the most. Now, if you pair that, if you do it by itself, it's okay. But what that can miss is our most natural talents and superpowers, which we take for granted because they seem too easy. So I say this, as you know, in my book, I say the thing about your biggest superpower is that you don't even notice it because it feels too easy to count because it's so natural to you. And so a really great way of drawing that out is to go back to what I said around personality profiles. So if you pair looking for your own evidence with a couple, and in my book, I link to a couple of profiles that I recommend. If you pair that with looking at your profiles, instead of saying, what does this tell me I am or am not, just use it to look for patterns. And when you draw this out, and I also recommend working with a great coach will really help with that. The evidence can be really strong. And the first thing that can happen is you can look at it and say, that doesn't count. Everyone can do that, which is everyone's first reaction. And the second thing that can happen is, but that's useless. That's not the good strength. That's not the strength everyone needs to do the thing I want to do, which are totally normal. Everyone has it. Even people of different personality profiles have it. So, but those are the first things to do. And when I've run this in groups, what happens is, you'll get people posting about what their strengths are and saying, I've discovered this, but it can't count. And someone who's the very opposite personality will come in and say, what are you talking about? Those are the good ones. I want those. And then they'll start telling each other how useful they are. And so that's why I always say, one big thing around anything to do with professional or personal growth is doing it by yourself. You're living with the issue, which is, you're too close to the problem. So I always get out of your own head. If you can find a good group, we have free range coaches on my website, or you can find your own resources. Go and work with someone who knows what they're doing, or at least people who are supportive of it, and who you can get out of your own head with. But the people I probably wouldn't go to with this are people in your life who feel very stuck in their own careers and maybe are not looking seriously at making a change. Because what will happen is they'll project their insecurities and their reasons why not onto you. So if you go to them and say, I found these things, are they really strengths? Can I do anything with them? While I'm sure they'll be very nice about them, they will probably reinforce the fact that, it's hard for people like us, isn't it? And so you don't want to go to them. You want to either keep it to yourself or go out to other people. And that really it's that external reinforcement with something like a few profiles mixed with, a process of looking for your own evidence. And then the next thing is to obviously try it out. And that's really how you discover it.
I think to go back to where people are thinking, well, this is all a bit pie in the sky, airy-fairy kind of stuff. I live in the real world. I've got bills to pay. I think you had your own struggles with that and your own kind of adversity to get through, to come out the other side, to be brave enough. Well, I think you probably described it as not even being brave to quit that corporate world. You did it out of necessities. You just felt you had to protect yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely did not expect to quit my job. Like I'm very, risk averse, and surprises people to hear that, but I am.
Mm.
I had a very conservative accountant father I grew up with. So I understood what risk looked like, and I didn't like the idea. And so I had this grand plan that I was going to be really sensible about this and micromanage the whole process, control freak. And so I had an idea, and I was like, I convinced my boss to let me go part-time, which was Herculean as a feat because he was a workaholic with major issues. And so he said yes because he didn't want to lose me, and I knew he didn't like it. And I was due to go to start part-time work so I could be really sensible and transition into this gradually and build up my coaching and consulting and other stuff on the side while having a secure income. Super excited. About a couple of weeks before that happened, the whole recession had just hit. The financial crash had happened. My job was safe, but I was watching all this unfold. So I was like, I definitely need to move on this. But a couple of weeks before I was meant to go part-time, something happened at work. I was incredibly stressed. I was running projects that probably were well above my pay grade, and I was always stressed. And one day I was out at a work event, and I happened to be moving some tables around because I was doing everything, and I pulled my back. And I remember I walked into the office the next day. I was on the tube in London. I was literally in tears on the tube, which, as you know, is not done because no one shows emotion. But I was actually crying because I was in so much pain. And I get into the office, and I walked into my boss's office and said, I'm going to have to go home, like after a few hours. There's no way I can stay. I have to go to the doctor. And he looks at me and he says, you can't leave today. And I'm like, I'm in so much back pain at this point and so anxious. Like I had got so anxious in my work. I was actually stuttering when I spoke, which is clearly not me. And I was literally at the point where it was normal for me to stutter at work. And so I was like stuttering. I was in this back pain. And my boss was saying, the project you're doing today is too important. You can't go. And I was like, no, I've actually done it. I was being realistic. I was like, no, I've handed off to the junior guy. We're on it. I promise it's all sorted. Wouldn't let me go. And so I remember I walked back into my office and I sat there and I called my partner at the time. I'm like, I can't do this. And he's like, just leave. And I wrote a resignation letter and I walked out. And that was literally how I quit, because I knew that my mental health was completely shot. Like I was so anxious, borderline depressed. I didn't know it at the time because I didn't know those words because no one was talking about it at the time. But now I recognize I had all those symptoms. And if I couldn't even take time out for a physical injury, there was no way we were taking time out for anything mental. And I had to do it because I was breaking. And so I think there does come a time when all this conversation I'd had about what's realistic and what's not, what stopped being realistic was staying in the job. Like that was no longer realistic. I wasn't going to function properly if I stayed there. And I think we don't look at the counterfactual sometimes when we look at what's realistic or not. Is it realistic to be growing to the place that you want to be? Is it realistic that things are going to change in a year's time? Things are going to change in 5 years, that this is going to be okay? If it's not realistic, then stop calling it realistic. Let's take that step. And maybe it doesn't need to be suddenly quitting your job, but it does need to be something. And for me, what happened as a result of that was I actually broke up with my partner within a few months of that happening. So I was living by myself in London without I didn't have family to go home to or anything. I was supporting myself and having to make a living in this expensive city in a recession without a job and picking my life up and putting it back together. And honestly, I always say if I hadn't quit my job in a recession, when actually the only jobs to go back to were ones I really, really, really didn't want, and there weren't many of them at all. If I didn't have that, if I'd had a huge amount of financial backing, I wouldn't be running the business I'm running, because I'd have gone back to a job or I'd have messed around pretending to run a business. But the fact that I really had within 6 months, I had to make this thing work. Within 3 months, I had to make it work, but I could stretch it to 6. And so I just believe that when you're really on the line with something, that's when you get serious. And so by the end of that year, I was earning as much as I had in that previous job, but it was because I had to hyper focus. So I always say, if you show up to work every day in a job that you don't like, you're already doing something that I now find completely unrealistic. I don't understand how that happens anymore. And, our version of reality is it's just what we're familiar with. So, for what you're looking at doing, whatever you're thinking of doing, there's people who are no smarter than you who are doing that. There are people who are probably a little bit dumb who are doing that, right? Let's be honest. And one of my clients once said to me, I love this. He said, because I used to think it was really complicated. I think it was a lawyer, actually. He said, I used to think it was all going to be really complicated because you're not actually asking to land on the moon. You're just asking to make a living as your own boss. He goes, this isn't it's not to say it's an overnight click the fingers, but it's not impossible. And the last thing I'll say is I think sometimes we feel it's impossible because it's important to us. You achieve more things that are probably impossible in your personal life and in the way you do your job than it really is to start your own thing. So that's not to minimize the work, but just to reframe it. It's just a thing people do. You're as capable as anyone else. So let's get practical and let's start taking action around it. And you don't have to quit your job tomorrow. And, I was able to because I had already started the projects. I had done the work. I didn't quit my job and go, oh, what am I going to do tomorrow? I knew where I was going. So, you can take steps to get there.
I spent the last year or so trying to think of business ideas, and the podcast is part of the result of that. But one of the things I really struggled with was I kept thinking, that's not an original idea. I would think of something and be like, someone else is already doing that. This person's doing that. They're going to do it way better than me. But you actually say the original idea is a bit of a myth.
Yes, absolutely. The original idea myth, I don't even know where it came from because it doesn't really have a basis in reality. I think sometimes we look at
in everything. My
really?
manager work asked me to look at a spreadsheet that someone else built that was just to track the different tasks in their team that were being done with who was doing it and what the deadline was and things like that. And I looked at it and it was great and it did everything that I needed it to. But there was a really stubborn part of me. It was like, I'm not just going to copy what someone else has done. I've got to do something that makes it better when I didn't need to.
Nice. Maybe you didn't need to, but I think that's a difference. That's a great example there because what you did was you took a thing that existed and you want to improve it. And I think that's very different from an original idea. An original idea would be coming up with that concept in the first place. And I think that's that fine point of difference that, when we're looking to start our own thing, it's very easy to say, oh, well, there are already people who are doing that, or I had this idea, but someone's done it. And the reality is, just like you say, you can put your own twist on something. Google wasn't the first search engine, right? Almost nothing that you use today was the first of its kind. Almost nothing you have paid money for in the last year was the first person to do it. So, but somehow when it comes to our stuff, that's the new metric for a good idea. And it's so flawed. So it's actually the first things I get people to move away from.
Yeah. And I think you say in the book as well that actually it's not a bad idea to let other people have the original idea and then improve on it because they do the groundwork of making the public aware of the idea and why they need it. And then you can swoop in and catch all the customers.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think that there's different people function well at different stages and we don't all need to be the person with the original idea. And also the person with the original idea is doing all your legwork for you, right? They're creating the market for you. I look at, say, online courses. When I started out, it was such a new thing. And now it's like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And while I think there's been pros and many cons around that, for me personally, I've been looking at this and going, oh, great. So instead of saying you guys have took all my clients, I'm like, all of you have now created a bigger market for me to play in. And so I've had the experience of being one of the earliest players and of just sort of I actually took a bunch of time off in the middle, whole other podcast episode of my business. I ended up completely taking down all my stuff and taking a time out of the space just to, really get a fresh view. And I came back and I'm like, oh, actually, it's pretty much the same now. It actually is probably easier because you've all created the market for me. So thank you. And so I always say, don't look at something and say it's too crowded. It's always about, something I ask myself is, does every potential customer in the world, are they already aware of all of these things that you're aware of? Probably not. If they're aware of all these things, do they have the perfect solution for them that they recognize as the perfect solution for them? Probably not. Is there room for you in there? Probably yes. And that's the way I always think. I think about how do I act as a consumer, not what am I telling myself I should be as the business person.
And that comes back to not just applying the free range human idea as a one size fits all, but there's actually elements to it that allow you to personalize it for yourself and your personality and the lifestyle that you want. One of those ideas then is the 3 different forms of free range human in terms of careers, where you have a bespoke career, which I think is like what you've done, a portfolio career, and an evolving career.
Yes, there's like so many different ways to form something to fit you. And the portfolio career, which I have examples of in the book, are people who have a very obviously varied career. So they may run several different businesses, for example. My example when I started out was 100% a portfolio career. Mm-hmm. But that's only one way of having variety and change and all of these positive things. The other way I like is having a bespoke career, which is very much what I teach and what I do. And that is where you take an idea and you tweak it to make it your own. So again, we have a lot of examples of this, but let's just say, I think someone in the book, Jen, who is in one of the new chapters in the new edition, she is an extreme introvert, and she started out a business in that sort of business that people would normally spend a lot of time on the phone in. But in order to deliver for her clients and do really well, she just can't be on the phone every day. She just burns out. She can't focus. Her head's all over the place. So in order to be the best at what she did, she's very clear with her communication style up front, and she silos different times and different days for communication, including taking a 1 day a week entirely just for her own business. And because, instead of saying, I remember when she started out, actually, she was one of my earliest clients. She went to some networking meeting in Brighton, I think once, and never went back. But she went there and this guy told her, was like, oh, well, if you have that type of business, you need to have your phone number on your website. You need to be present all the time or you won't have any clients. And then she came back to me and she was like, I don't think he knows free range humans. And, instead she got a very tight niche of a certain type of person who really wants to have the results, who isn't there just to like call you up all the time and be super annoying at you. And she puts how she works very, very clearly up front. So she always is like, I do it this way so I can deliver quality for you. And that's just one example where she's now made her career, like her days of the week, totally different. In what I do, there are so many ways to deliver the sort of work I do. I can run events in person. I could run them online. I could do them in a really creative way. I could do them in a really structured way. I could do one-on-one work. And in a way, it doesn't matter what other people are doing. It's where are you going to shine and how do you want to do it? And so that's what I call a bespoke career. There's so many ways you can be creative. And, if you have a billion ideas, for example, you could attach a book club to your business around the topic that you do. Like that could be a paid thing or it could be a free thing that grows, your reputation. So you can take all your interests that you have and you can pick a couple that are really key and see how do I weave that a little bit into what I do. And again, I could go on forever, but there's so many ways to do this.
We've talked about technology quite a bit. Can the free range human method work without technology? Can you do it like unplugged?
Well, interesting unplugged. I think very few of us are fully unplugged these days. But if you mean without like a website, is that what you mean? Like without a web presence, like just talking online, that sort of thing?
I guess I think without any of the digital kind of elements.
I mean, the theory still holds. Like especially in the era of COVID, I think we are all very digital right now. But yes, like the whole idea isn't that there's one way to have success. It is not create a website, put an email list down, learn how to use Facebook ads. Heads up, I'm not a fan of using Facebook ads. That's my other rant we don't have time for. When you're starting out, it's fine when you're established. But anyway, so there's not just this one formula. It's one that fits your needs and your strengths and your personality and your success style and all of these very bespoke things. So if you are someone who functions better with in-person conversations, why on earth would you not focus on that? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why would you say you have to go that way? And so, no, you don't need to have all those things. I just think that tools like, say, Zoom and the ability to have conversations more widely and allow people to spread things for you is a really helpful tool. But I always say that I love collaborating with people. And I met my first business partner for a different business in person, in London. Like, we actually met face to face. And I think that's so important, whether it's on a Zoom screen or in a cafe. But we connected because of a website, because I think it was meetup.com at the time. But so often you can use a digital connection, but do it in person if you're not a digital type of person. And that can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, these things are all tools and we can use them in negative ways or positive ways.
Exactly.
So Marianne, we're coming up to time and I don't want to end up taking up your whole day. Well, I would love to, but you probably won't let me do that. Maybe we can sum up by what would you say to someone who's, sitting on the train, maybe in a commute to the centre of London or wherever, and they're like, I really need to get out of this. What would you say to them?
I would say, you're not asking to land on the moon. This is not impossible, but it requires a different way of thinking. It requires different inputs. And to maybe to definitely move out of our comfort zone. So I would say, do the thing you haven't been doing. Have you been reading the thing you should be reading? Have you been doing the exercises? Have you been running the project? And if you've done that, have you been getting input? So I just always troubleshoot your minimum viable next step. What's the next thing that I haven't done that I could be doing? And actually put it in your calendar. Either do it immediately or put it in your calendar, because this is the one thing I would say is take your dreams seriously. Because if you don't, you'll get to that office and something will come up, or you'll get home and something will come up. So put it in the calendar and treat it as seriously as you would anything else in your life. And, it's one step at a time.
Yeah, the companies we work for aren't necessarily interested in our dreams.
Probably not that interested, no. So it's up to us to be our own best boss, for sure.
Yeah. And reading those books, those websites, doing those courses and things, tell us where we can find your book and your website and your courses.
Yes, so the book is Be a Free Range Human. And to make sure you get the latest updated edition, extended edition, go to beafreerangehuman.com and you can just get all the link outs to the places you'd want to go to get it. You can also check me out at free-range-humans.com and go from there.
Fantastic. And I'll have that stuff on the website as well. Marianne, I think one of the things that makes me different to other people is I get really excited talking about ideas like this. So this has just been so much fun. Thanks very much for doing it.
Thank you. It's been great.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app to help us get noticed. And you can get in touch on Twitter or through the website. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.